Anyway, good morning. Thank you to our sponsors first. So we have an Unconference track tomorrow. So today we have 2 parallel speaking tracks. Tomorrow we have an Unconference track. When I asked for feedback last year, basically people wanted to have less parallel sessions, and they wanted to take more elements of the hackathons we run every year. So this shows you some pictures from the hackathon we had earlier in spring, which was hosted by ARM. So let me just explain how the Unconference part really works, and then this is all really designed to. We also have a social event today. That's from 7 to 9. So we're going to finish about, I think, just before 6 o'clock, as far as I recall, according to the schedule. And it takes about, I've walked up there, it's about a 10 minutes walk. It's relatively easy. We're here, it's pretty much a straight line, and it's at the Hockey Hall of Fame, and at registration, there'll also be handouts, basically giving you this. So that's the logistics of today. So I wanted to kind of cover some of the topics and key milestones which have happened since the last summit, last August. So we actually had 2 releases. We had the Xen 4 release in January. We introduced a new release model. So we are moving from longer releases, which we're at the beginning of each release cycle. We chose an endpoint to which we try to work to a fixed release cycle, and we'll cover a little bit about this later. The project is now fully self-reliant in terms of sysadmin and infrastructure. So the advisory board basically funds a company called Credative, and they do all the sysadmin for us. And that's been working really well. And as a result of this, actually you saw a lot of changes, partly to our infrastructure. We moved from HTTP to HTTPS sites. We occasionally had upgrades, and for that reason, maintenance windows, and so on and so forth. You may remember that in the last few years, we've always been talking about the code review process and how we could improve that. So I'll cover a little bit about that as well. We had some changes to the leadership team of the hypervisor. So we had a number of new committers. So can each committer and member of the hypervisor leadership team just stand up such that others can see you? Here we go. So those are the guys, which you need to convince to get your patches in. We also have a few maintainers. So could the maintainers please stand up? I'm going to make you work, right? There's
a lot more that's not here.
Yeah, there's a lot more who are not here. Yeah, we were a little bit unfortunate with red tape this year. So, Stefano was supposed to be here, but he can't come due to visa issues. Wei, couldn't be here as well. So, he got his visa approved on Friday, and then it takes, 5 days to get the actual visa into the passport. So that would be tomorrow. That would be a bit late, right? But that's unfortunate, and these sort of things happen. I also wanted to welcome Huawei as a new advisory board member. So we have 13 advisory board members now. So for your background, each board member pays a bit of money into a common pot, and that's then used to help the community to solve specific problems, such as buy test infrastructure, run our infrastructure, help with PR, or solve specific fund events like this, and help with point problems such as develop some tools or whatever to help us improve how we work. We also delivered the 4.7 release was a couple of months ago, and we had our first Windows PV driver release. So Paul, who sits over there and has the same T-shirt, he runs the Windows PV driver project, and those drivers are also signed and properly signed using Xen Project certificates. Now, if you have any questions during that talk, just interrupt me, raise your hand, because I want this whole day to be interactive rather than just us talking to you. And and you should all really work together as well, build bridges, and make this whole thing a bit more productive. So I just wanted to run through some of the key things which have changed this year. So there's been a lot of change in the way how we work. And so the first thing, I covered already some of this, so I'm just going through this. This is just a summary slide, and we'll see what happens. So we had some changes to the leadership team. We basically, for a very long time, we've had a very stable group of committers, and now some of them have changed companies, and some of them stepped down, like Kier and Tim fundamentally stepped down as committers. Tim is still engaged in the community. So we kind of felt, it's important to bring some new blood into the community. And the way how we approach this, and this worked really, really well, is that once a year, we're going to prompt, usually around springtime, we're going to prompt the entire community to suggest people who have been making outstanding contributions, who've been maintainers, and who should be maintainers and who should be on the, or maybe who should be committers. There's basically a private mailing list. It's called committers, xenproject.org. And fundamentally, anyone at any time can make a pitch to suggest somebody to become part of the project leadership. And then the existing leadership will look at that and, and fundamentally, say, well, yes, it's great suggestion. That person would make an ideal maintainer or a committer, and once a year we will publicly actually call people towards that process. So we have 4 new people who joined the leadership team. So we had Andrew Cooper, we have George as well, we have Stefano. Stefano unfortunately couldn't make it today, and we have Wei as well. Wei is also the release manager, and we also had a number of new maintainers, and also Jürgen Gross, for example, from SUSE is one of our new Xen Linux maintainers too. We also made a few governance changes. So in 2015, we had a number of surveys and discussions around how do we actually work, what's the boundary between maintainers, and so we made some changes around the idea of nested maintainership. So basically, the idea here is we have maintainers own certain parts of the code, and some people might own a directory, and then some people might own a bigger part, and then the committers fundamentally own everything. And so we just clarified how people interact with each other. I already covered how we propose new people. So that was just like that new process around committers at xenproject.org. And there's a current proposal on the table, which is really a major overhaul of our governance. So have a look at this and provide feedback. There's already some feedback out there. I was going to send out a new revision in 2 or 3 weeks, but that proposal fixes some ambiguities and difficulties which we've discovered, in the last 1 year or 2. And it mainly deals with how do we make decisions, how do we deal with conflict if it does occur, how do we resolve this. We introduced the project leadership team as a concept, and we're also fixing some areas which are really gray in terms of how do we make decisions across different projects. Because there's the Hypervisor project, but there's also the XAPI project. We have the Windows PV driver project, and Mirage OS as well, which is all hosted by the within the Xen project. That's kind of the sort of more boring stuff out of the way. I know you're all not very excited about process, and it's all about technology, but process is sometimes important. This space down there. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about making testing a little bit easier for all of you. Testing and quality has been becoming increasingly important for us as a community. So the advisory board has, funded the OSS test, which is our Xen Project CI loop. And we have a rack of various different pieces of hardware there. And that provides, functional tests via the command line, either via Excel or, libvirt and virsh. And, every, basically on a cron job, when there's enough time, a set of changes which got pushed to staging fundamentally get tested. And when a test succeeds, that set of changes gets pushed to master and goes in. That test framework can be set up in a standalone fashion, but it's kind of quite hard to do. And so not a lot of people do this today. And it's also hard to test low-level functionality via the command line. If you just want to test whether a hypervisor, a hypercore works, well, trying to do this via the command line isn't really that straightforward. And to run the entire test suite, that also takes up a significant amount of compute resources, and for that reason, time. So really, what we needed to help us fix this is a new tool, which is easy to write low-level tests and which is quick, to execute, and which is really easy to run tests for manually on your box. And Andy actually wrote something like that, and I'll just explain a little bit how this works. And if I get it wrong, please correct me, right? Do you want me to change it? Well, sorry. Anyway, so thank you for contributing the XTF framework. And here is how it works, right? So, we have the hypervisor with our DOM0, and within a VM, there's fundamentally a microkernel that's actually very slim. How many lines of code or files are this roughly?
It runs in 20 kilobytes.
It runs in 20 kilobytes, right? Very slim. And basically, for each test, you have an individual file which with a test_main entry point. And it's ideal to test things like hypercores, event channels, x86 emulator, and things like XenStore, QEMU, and the various backend drivers. It's fundamentally a unikernel with some safeguards removed, such that you can do sort of setup and more checking. And it's also very useful to investigate issues and for debugging. So that's actually the history, how this whole thing started. We needed an environment where we were trying to reproduce a specific vulnerability. And that's basically, how this whole, approach was put together. And the nice thing about it is, like those original tests for specific vulnerabilities, you can just run those on a specific version of Xen, and it'll tell you whether specific vulnerability is in the code or not, as a simple yes or no answer. Is that correct? Yeah. And then, if you attach a debugger to it, then you could also, use it for investigation and so on and so forth. So that's the status of this. It's currently x86 only, so it'd be great, if we could get an ARM port at some point. As I said, it's useful for functional testing. It's useful for POCs and debugging, and it's also useful to just write little scripts which dump information, which you normally wouldn't get in a specific environment. Currently, we're integrating it with OSS test, so the patches have been posted, and I think the XDF repo is being created already on xen.git. And we're moving the documentation to a better. Oh, that's done as well. Cool. And then there's basically on xenbits, there's an xdf.git directory, so have a look at that. It is really rather cool. Even I can do that, right? And it's also very well documented, so you can look at the documents on xenbits.org docs xdf. And there's quite an extensive set of examples in there as well. So longer-term goals around this is to write comprehensive tests for existing interfaces. And also I hope that, for new features, as they get contributed, we will, submit them with XDF tests, given that it's actually relatively easy, or very easy to really write them. I mean, usually they're just, how big is a typical, integration test for a new feature? Just give me a little bit of an example.
I've never written one for a new feature. I'm still covering existing features that previously had security vulnerabilities in them.
Okay, but I mean, I looked at some of the bigger examples, and they're like 30, 40 lines of code.
I think the biggest example is 200 lines of code.
200, biggest example for a test around 200 lines of code, so that's kind of really quite powerful. So this is, for example, a topic which would be great for one of these Unconference sessions. So are you going to run one around XDF tomorrow?
I can do, although I'll have to avoid the slot that I'm speaking in.
Yeah, of course. Anyone who would be interested in, so I'm just making you work in sync, who'd be interested in participating? And yeah, quite a fair number, yeah. So that looks as if we actually should hold one. So another thing, sorry, Doug, for the picture. I just had to, find some pictures of people, right? We have a Travis CI loop now as well. And Doug, who sits there, set that up for the community. And basically, the way how this works is fundamentally on a, basically on a certain period of time, Travis just checks GitHub, and then it will build test.
Every time somebody pushes.
Oh, actually, every time we push it. Oh, I thought it was originally, like maybe every 10 minutes, and then it.
It was, but I fixed it to be a push.
Oh, great. So every single time, when you push something to staging, a build test is run, and then the results are posted on Xen test. Are they posted anywhere else as well, or just on an IRC channel?
If you are signed up on GitHub and you have your committer email address and your GitHub profile, it will send you an email when you break.
When you break the build. Cool. So I guess, if you want to get the emails and not pull Xen test, you ought to really sign up on GitHub.
Could it be posted on Xen Dev otherwise by default?
The original series was posting it to Xen Dev, and that was bring up re-adding it. But
Last one.
I mean, there's things we could do. We could have a discussion about how to do some of this. Like we could have a dedicated mailing list for results, or I mean, I don't want to spam XenDevel with all those. That would be, not ideal. But yeah,
it doesn't break all that often anymore.
it does. Cool. So thank you for doing that and taking the initiative to make that happen. Oh, we're going backwards. Actually, I wanted to go forward. I wanted to talk a little bit about changing needs and how we're tackling some of the challenges. So security has been one of the challenges we, as well as the entire industry, has been dealing with since Snowden. Fundamentally, we should have probably dealt with this earlier, but since then it's on everybody's mind. And for us, really the start of basically being pushed into the limelight as a project happened in September 2014, and then to a lesser degree a few months afterwards when a Xen vulnerabilities triggered a reboot of part of Amazon and other cloud providers. Now, I don't know if you remember, we then said, well, actually, it's really not acceptable for us, to make vendors and cloud providers suffer, the impact and their users having to have downtime, because of Xen vulnerabilities. So we had a number of stakeholders, some of them in this room, others, not here, get together and basically design our live patching solution. So I remember, we had some very coarse discussions on a mailing list. I think, Conrad, when we started around June, July, maybe, right, last year, having some initial discussions, but properly, the first proper discussion we had at the BOF about a year ago. And, Conrad, some folks from Amazon, Alibaba, Ross, and various other people got together, agreed a design, we posted it, and in fact, we had the first version of this released in June 2016. And that really shows that, when we have a problem and we collaborate and we set our mind to solving a problem, we can turn things around, very, very quickly. Now, I wanted to thank, Conrad and, others who do, and Ross, and you will hear more about this later down the line. Jan was also quite heavily involved at the beginning for really making this happen. And, I hope we'll have more of these kind of cross-company collaborations, where in a very short time we just can solve specific problems which are important to our entire community. So that model seems to work extremely well, and we can, pull this off extremely well as well. Now, one of the side effects of that cloud reboot was that fundamentally since then, every single Xen vulnerability became a big media story. And the thing is, I don't entirely understand, why we get singled out compared to other projects. And, for almost a year, the stories have escalated. Like first it was just, oh, there's a vulnerability, right? And then, then we found a QEMU vulnerability and the Xen project handled it. And then the stories became, oh, Xen and QEMU are falling out. And the press was finding all these interesting angles to make those stories sell a bit more. And usually, everything they told us was actually wrong, right? And, well, clickbait, it's good. Publicity is good, but negative publicity isn't really good. So we've been grappling about, how can we, we've been trying to solve this somehow. So first we thought, well, actually, what seems to be the case is the media and a lot of our, people in the ecosystem don't actually understand how we handle security vulnerabilities. They didn't understand, that we had a very well-working pre-disclosure process, that by the time a vulnerability is published on the public mailing list, it's actually fixed, in all the major clouds and in all our products. So that helped a little bit, but it wasn't really sufficient. Like even after we had done that and after we had started to educate people, there would still be press stories which basically implied that, every vulnerability by the time it was published was actually a 0-day. And we hadn't had a single 0-day vulnerability ever in the entire lifetime we know of, in the entire lifetime of the project. If you compare that to Linux, that's, they had a number of 0-day vulnerabilities. You just need to go to CVE details, and actually, there are quite a few. So then we had, then we kind of started to think about, well, actually, we have to start responding, to some of the misinformation which is out there. So XS A148, that was an issue in a PV driver that created a big story, and we decided to respond with a blog. But what we didn't quite understand at the time was that by the time we decided, on a day the story came out, because we didn't know how big it was going to be, so we didn't want to prepare anything or proactively write a blog, and we didn't want to actually create the story ourselves, right? So we when it broke, we decided to put something together. By the time, it was reviewed, the news cycle was over, and once we got our message out, nobody really cared anymore, right? And so what we're now doing, together with the PR team at the Linux Foundation and with the security team, is when we think something could be problematic from a press perspective, we prepare a number of statements, like a FAQ or something. And as soon as the story breaks, we basically get, somebody provide, like the Register or one of the other news outlets, if they, publish wrong information, we get them to correct that. And it usually goes very quickly, in the last vulnerability, usually we manage to get an article corrected within an hour or two. And then at least, misinformation doesn't spread, because, what we found beforehand during the news cycle is one reporter writes something, then another one copies something, and suddenly you have all this, wrong information everywhere. And that worked quite well, and I guess, we're just moving to trying to manage this whole process a little bit better. Another thing which was interested is that sort of generally, generally the media is very interested in a project. So, whenever we do something interesting, there'll be a news story around it. Like when we changed the release process, it got covered in the Register, right? The Register and some news outlets even read our mailing list now, right? That really surprised me. For example, when we had a discussion about the 4.7 release and it was going to slip, there was a discussion about, the slippage on Xen Devel. And then the next day there was a Register article, on the mailing list. Saying, Xen 4.7, slips, and then also, oh yeah, and by the way, it's going to have these features in it because they actually track our roadmap emails as well, right? So just be aware of that, what you say might get used against you at some point, so because the press actually reads our mailing lists. Again, I don't know, other projects don't get that, but hey, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But just be aware of this. And we shouldn't really change behavior, but we should just be aware of it, that this might happen. So the upshot of all of this is, fundamentally, as a community, we can respond to changing needs. We can respond to it quite quickly, and we're actually quite good at it. And thank you for helping make this happen. So I'm running behind time, so I'm just going to go very quickly through some stats from last year. So actually, this shows the overall growth in terms of organizations and developers who've contributed per year to all our sub-projects. That's the Hypervisor, that's XAPI, that's Mirage OS, which is one of the unikernel projects, the Windows driver project, and so on and so forth. And then here, you also see the same trajectory in terms of commits. I don't have the figures for this year yet, across all projects, because I'm slightly struggling in particular with the Mirage OS project, which keeps on creating new repositories all the time, but they don't have a master list of all the repositories, so I can't really accurately track what's going on. And I'm working with them, to find a way to automate that process. They just create repositories all the time. This is what the Hypervisor commits look like. So this is just a Hypervisor, and this were the commits up to basically the beginning of August, and a green bit is a little bit of a projection. Now, what's actually interesting about this is why, I was asking myself, why do we have this strange step curve in there? And actually what is really happening is the amount of code freeze periods really affects how many changes we can take in, right? So in 2014, we released Xen 4.4, but also at the end of the year, for almost 2 months, we were in code freeze for the 4.5 release, right? So that meant that a lot of changes were actually deferred into the next year. And then, in 2015, we only had 1 code freeze, but we had 1 release. And this year, of course, we have, 2 code freezes and 2 releases. But the good news is that actually we've been growing in terms of 10% on average every year for the last 3 years, and it looks as if this is going to continue. There might be some disruption around the new release process because we're now always doing 2 releases, and for that reason, we're going to have possibly longer code freeze periods. So we'll have to experiment and see how we optimize that whole process and what impact that will make. Then I wanted to look at a slightly wider picture. Xen itself doesn't actually stand on its own. There's a lot of Xen-related drivers and devices, for example, in Linux and QEMU, in the BSDs as well. And we also have the Xen libvirt driver. So basically in this graph, I just did the same exercise for all the Xen-only code in those projects, and that shows basically exactly the same trend. So then I kind of wanted to look at really how balanced is our community. Are we becoming more diverse? Are we becoming less diverse, and so on and so forth? And that was really interesting. If you look at the distribution of where the major changes came from in 2009, 80% of all the changes in 2009 came from Citrix, right? And then there were very few other major contributors to the project. In 2015, this already looks, very different, right? So Citrix basically contributed half of the code. SUSE and Oracle and Intel are major contributor. There's also changes from Red Hat. So I think you remember last year, some of the Red Hat folks did some changes to the debug support. And we also had a talk at the summit. And then there were a lot of other companies who regularly contribute to the project. And remember, this is just while we're growing, while the contributions are growing, we're becoming more diverse. If I look at these stats today, that picture is becoming even more so. So as a community, we're basically becoming more diverse and we're becoming more distributed. And there's a number of really interesting newcomers, there as well, like ARM, Aporito. Aporito is a new startup where Stefano Stabilini works for. As I said, Stefano unfortunately can't make it. We had contributions from Bosch and Netflix as well, which is really quite interesting. So as a community, really, while we've been growing, we've been becoming more diverse. And that's really, really good. So I wanted to talk a bit about code review, because that's an area where we had some problems. So I'm going to start off with a very short history. At the Developer Summit in 2014, we basically discovered that we had some problems with code reviews. Code reviews became less efficient. Some vendors complained that it took them longer to get the code in. And then I started to ask various people in a community to try and understand what's going on. And I got lots of different messages. For example, one of the theories we had at the time was that contributions are more complex. They're touching more different areas of code. And for that reason, it just naturally, takes longer to get the code in. Another theory was that we didn't have enough people reviewing the code, or that, all the newcomers, write lower quality code, or, some people even thought we just fight all the time and don't really review things. And nothing really actually, none of the answers I got made any sense, like, every single time I asked a question, I got a different answer. So I couldn't really do anything with this. So we had no real conclusion. But actually, we had to do something. So we just went for actually some common sense things, which we already started and which make sense anyway. So we focused on architecture and design reviews. The theory there was that actually, maybe we have more complex changes. So if we agree a design and an architecture beforehand, that would, remove the need to have discussions about code, because all the big issues, will be solved up front. And that worked really well. And again, Andy Cooper has been pioneering some of that around migration v2, and we're seeing, more features really going through, proper design reviews as well. We did this with live patching as well. Some of the changes Stefano is submitting, there's a nice, interesting design document around it. And it's a really good way to engage early on. I also created training for newcomers. And, once or twice a year, I kind of went around and to sites where we had new developers, across the world, particularly also in China. And that has helped improve things. But we also funded Bitergia to do a study and develop some tooling to help us understand how the review process works. And I just wanted to share some initial results, and then I wanted to give a very, very brief demo how those tools work. And then I'm going to run a BOF tomorrow if you're interested, and show you in detail how these tools work and how you can use them to track your patches. Anyway, so the initial study showed that while the the amount of patch series which were committed went up. The amount of comments which were posted, about these patch series went up at even a faster speed. Then we ran some, statistical analysis, and this shows the median, the 25th percentile, the 75th, and then the 95th, and then we had a spike in 2014, and then actually in 2015 things started to get back to normal and to sort of our long-term average. And it sort of seems to imply that some of the things we did around the time to help and address these issues have actually worked. And then those graphs on the right kind of just test, that theory for various different sizes of patches. There were a few other findings as well, which are really quite interesting. So, a series, like typically our patch series are about 1.8 patches big. And then we have a few very large patch series typically, and those take about 10 times longer than a series which is of the size of 6 or 7 patches. And it was quite surprising, right? So if you have a series of 21 patches, it takes 10 times longer than a series of 7 patches to get into the code base. And that's just like a function of complexity. So maybe we need to think about breaking things into smaller, more logical units which are related to each other. Maybe that helps. So that's something you actually maybe ought to think about.
Lars,
Yeah.
like if you were going to advise someone how to break down the series, what would be the sweet spot for an idea?
That is a good question. So I think this really, it actually depends on the person and organization and the code area. So what I would advise you is to sit together with me and play around the dashboard, because that dashboard actually allows you to look at historical data, and it allows you to see, I can, for example, go in there and check how long on average during a release period it took me to get certain patches in. And you can then use your own historical data to find your own sweet spot. And now I got, that's basic, but yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer. But I think it does appear that the majority of patches which go in are around stuff which is around 1 to 10. Goes relatively fast, and then it starts to become really slow. And part of it might just be, it might be coordination issues. Maybe there's too many acts from too many different people involved, and it's just really hard to get, everybody lined up to look at things at the same time.
I think that is one of the things. I don't think that the main issue is not big series. It's very big patch doing multiple things in the same one. Some series that maybe 20 patch can go really quick because it's really small patch and really easy to do.
Yeah, there's also, of course, small patches might, a series might be lots of small ones, but you could also have, of course, a series which has 3 patches, and then the 3 patches are very big, right? I just don't have an easy way to track that, today in the tools. So you're right. That is definitely a thing, and that's maybe an area where we need to improve those tools to get us, better data, right? I think the other thing which has happened is that, over the last few years, we were talking about vulnerabilities and qualities, of course, that, the demands on the project are rising as well. So the expectation is that, code has to be of better quality, it's getting vetted, and looked at by more people, and that obviously also requires more time, because everybody cares about quality and security more than, say, 10 years ago, right? Now, actually, one thing is I pulled some of the stats about people who do reviews, and the good thing is that actually in the last 4 releases, we're really having more people who, and from more different vendors, starting to review the code. Now these are actually, like our top people who started to provide comments on various patches, and you see in 4.6, it was SUSE, Citrix, and Intel reviewing. There's 3 organizations, and then 4.7 there's new people coming in each release cycle. That's not entirely not an entirely accurate view. So in this case, it's just people commenting on patches. There's also other angles, such as people providing reviewed by and act by and all those other different tags. Anyway, and then we developed the dashboard, and that dashboard is now operating on live data. All right, so basically, there's a documentation tab. If you click that, it links you to all the documentation. One of the key things about that is a thing called a time picker. So this picks the things, like there we have some of the release cycles pre-coded. So let me just look at sort of 4.8, right? And it's getting the various data from the 4.8 release cycle, and it shows all sorts of different data. But I wanted to focus on, let's just say, Data Explorer up there. I'm glad we're not spending that's a little bit awkward. So I was just going to show you some of the patches which I submitted recently, and that's, there's some keywords which I can just put sender. Oh, there's no H, that's why. So there's obviously nobody submitted a patch like this, all right? And then you can see, there you see the patch series I submitted, the constituting bits. You can also see, what I commented on, and then you can filter this in very different ways. You also see flags like has it been merged? So this hasn't been merged, this hasn't been merged, this has been merged. You can go back to the actual email thread on MarkInfo, and there's a lot of things you can do with these tools which can help you with the workflow. And I'd be very willing, to give anyone an in-depth demo who cares about it. I think it's very useful, and I also need feedback to make this more useful for you guys all. The way how it works is we suck all the information out of the Mailman database, and then we correlate it with all the Git commits. And it basically, allows us to model the entire process. And that's really cool. And incidentally, it will also work for, like for Linux, QEMU, and a lot of other projects. And we're starting to work with those projects as well to see whether, they're interested in that kind of technology. So to close the talk and summarize, I need your input on the code review process. And there's a few things where we know we have some issues. There's a lot of cross-posting, for example, on Xendevel today, and we're only matching commits to our own repositories. At some point, we want to match them to other repositories like the BSDs and Linux, libvirt, and so on as well. I want to make sure that the UI and everything is more useful, and for that I need your feedback. And it's actually very easy to add new customized views, which just have data which you guys care about. But I think it's useful for predicting how long it will take for you to get patches in, to track things. I think it's also useful for maintainers and committers. There's also a question about, can we make the review process overall a little bit more tools friendly, right? So there's some issues, like it's not always entirely clear. For example, how do you identify a patch which has been abandoned? There's no way of actually identifying stuff like that. And then there's questions about, do we need something to, do we need a convention to help us identify patches like that, which can then be tracked in a tool. So to summarize, as a community, we've been becoming more vibrant, more diverse. We're quite capable of addressing diverse challenges. And, we've actually been innovating in a lot of different areas, particularly around security and graphics and a few other areas. And you'll be hearing about this in the next 2 days. And thank yous. I wanted to close this with a few questions if you have. And then George and I will give Way's roadmap and status update talk. Any questions at this stage?